I'm a clinical sex therapist here in Melbourne, Australia. I specialize in working with individuals and couples. A lot of people come in with sexual issues, communication, conflict, pain. So I work with just people on working on what they want to bring to the table and how to find a happy, healthy sex life.
What would you say are some of those foundational keys to having a happy, healthy sex life? I feel like that's something everyone wants, right? But
Exactly. A lot of people walk around with shame and guilt, perhaps unresolved trauma. And a lot of people have this underlying belief that they're not good enough. And so when that translates into the bedroom, people have all kinds of, I guess, you know, just thoughts in their head that they're not good enough. And they kind of look at sex from a performative perspective rather than connection or intimacy.
that is fascinating. Would you say, from your perspective, your experience and knowledge, that the connection aspect of our intimacy is needed in order to have good sex?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not, a lot of people, sex means to them connection. So I ask most people who come into my office, what does sex mean to you? And I would say almost all of the time, an element of the response is connection. And so, is that needed for a great sex? Sometimes, most of the time, it really depends on the context of the sex you're having. A very common issue that I see would be one of the individuals in that couple wants sex more often than the other. So it's a little bit of a libido disparity. And so one partner is feeling rejected, one partner is feeling, I guess, isolated or lonely, or that their needs aren't being met. And then the other partner is feeling pressured and having to, I guess, meet that partner and meet their needs. And then sex then becomes a chore, or sex becomes routine or expected.
Here at Live Jasmin, that is something that we see a lot in members. There are members that could be married, but they have this particular fantasy that their spouse just has zero interest in exploring with them. And so their way of still trying to explore, fulfill that part of themselves is to not necessarily introduce someone physically into their lives and relationship, but instead to have this online relationship with a model.
I've been talking a lot about that this week is policing fantasies and the element of what we allow our partner to know about our eroticism or our fantasies and what we want to hold to ourselves and how can we explore that if we even want to. Sometimes it's just the mental element that is really, I guess, erotic and arousing.
So sometimes just having the fantasy might be enough for some people. Like they don't
Correct.
need to really explore.
Yeah, exactly. Especially for even more taboo fantasies where people have that sense of guilt, or a lot of people feel abnormal. And this is weird. This would be strange for me to have this thought to get aroused on a particular topic that would seem very taboo to mainstream culture.
What are your thoughts around fantasy and exploring them? Do you feel like it's healthy for us to explore fantasy? I know you just mentioned that, sometimes we ourselves may not even want to and need to. It's kind of just this secret we have in our head or whatever the case may be.
I would say exploring fantasies is really tricky for some people because they find it hard to communicate what that fantasy is. And they're, I think, fearful that their partner would reject them or ridicule them, or they'd be judged. And nobody wants to have those things happen in the bedroom. But I think exploring fantasies is such an important part of our sexuality. And, I just think everyone should be able to, I guess, celebrate what it is that they find arousing and hopefully find a partner that they can communicate that with.
Absolutely. And, there's so many different there's what, 8 billion people on the planet, and everyone has something that turns them on that may not be what someone else likes.
Exactly.
Where do our arousals stem from? Like, is it just random? Is it something in our development? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is a research that suggests that we do have an erotic blueprint, that there are some, especially when it comes to fetishes and kinks, that sometimes these would have been developed in childhood. And then once we get into our sexuality, they will then kind of come to fruition. Other things sometimes are just things that we like and enjoy. And sometimes it's building upon something that we like and enjoy that's like inherently within us, and it's the beauty of exploring that, and I guess pushing the boundaries a little bit and really exploring pleasure in that way.
How important, in your opinion, is it for us to explore pleasure? Because I think we can all agree that pleasure and sex and sexuality, it's definitely the topic at hand. Everyone's very interested and curious and talking about it right now. However, it's still extremely stigmatized and it's still extremely taboo.
That's a good question. I think when we look at pleasure being I guess, the goal, right? The fundamental aspect of what we're trying to achieve, because everyone's pleasure is very different. If we're looking at, I guess, writing a sexual script, that sex has to go a very particular way, or our bodies have to behave a certain way, that kind of pigeonholes and really hinders the sexual experience. But if we're looking at it from a pleasure perspective, we can jump into our bodies and not worry about what the outside world is trying to tell us what we should be doing. And so our bodies can like different things at different points in time. And if pleasure is the focus, I think that's where the magic really then starts to happen.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. What are your thoughts around the societal obsession with sexuality, but the shunning of it at the same time? Where does that come from, and how do we start to move away from that collectively?
Well, it is really interesting because you're right. It's this really confusing message that's sent out to people, right? Especially for women in particular, is that if you like sex, if you enjoy it, if you have lots of sexual partners, then that's really that then borders on like slut shaming, right? But if you're too prudish and you're closed off, exactly. So it's like society wants to kind of pigeonhole what sex should be, right? This is what our roles are. This is what the sex is for. This is how you're supposed to behave. And then anything that is an outlier is therefore shunned and then strange or abnormal. It's this like weird obsession of what's normal. And that's a word that I really dislike talking about when it comes to sex, because there is no normal, right? A lot of people and couples want to know, what is normal? Am I normal? And I think whatever is unique and healthy and consenting and pleasurable, that's everyone's normal, rather than fitting into what we have to be, because that's where people feel comfortable.
Yeah, I actually interviewed an expert not too long ago who said he wishes we could just do away with that word because, like
Yes,
I said, there's no normal. And so when just having that word is confusing for people because we think that there is a normal and we think that we don't fit into that or whatever the case is, when we all are so unique.
exactly. Exactly. And then therefore, if we're not normal, then we're probably not good enough. And there's something then wrong with us. And then when we look at sexuality through the lens of there's something wrong with us, that really hinders the experience.
Yeah, you mentioned at the start of our call, which is that, if someone is struggling with self-esteem issues or whatever the case is, then they may go into a sexual experience more performative, but not really connective. If you had to guess, how many people do you think are suffering from self-esteem issues that is hindering them from having proper connection in their life?
I would say, wow, that's hard to guess, but I would say because I have a very specific sample size of right people who are coming into therapy, but I mean, I would say majority of people who come into my office have some degree of a self-esteem issue. I would say at least 50%,
Mm.
right? Who don't, especially after having children, changes in their life, changes over time, changes post-COVID. A lot of people just, yeah, they just don't feel good about themselves. And therefore, that does change their sexual experience. It doesn't let them open up, and it doesn't let their partner in either.
If I gave you a microphone that was going to just broadcast into every person's home throughout the whole world, and you could give them one message about sexuality that you wish people understood, but they don't yet, what would it be?
That sexuality is okay, that it's safe, that it's not anything to fear, that it's something that we are allowed to experience as humans. And it is a wonderful thing to experience. And whatever that you like and don't like is unique to you. And that is 100% okay.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. I think that is kind of the link that people are missing is this permission to go there, to be sexual, because there's still this subconscious shame and guilt, I think, where it's kind of like, oh, I need to keep it hidden or it's dirty or something like that. Our messaging around sexuality is still um Puritan, is that what it's called? Or still purity consciousness and yeah.
Exactly. And it's also not normal, like going back to the word normal though, it's not normalized. It's not part of a conversation where it's about, it's sexual health, it's our sexual well-being. So to look at it from, very judgmental lens or perspectives, it's just changes, what sexual health actually is. So, it's really tricky because on one hand, yeah, people want to shun that. And if it's normalized, you can talk about it in any way, in any capacity. And then if that was allowed, if that was accepted, then other people wouldn't feel the need to shun it or to guilt, or to shame others.
How do we start generating a more sex healthy society?
Yeah. Well, look, I think through education and, changing the generations to come, right? If we're looking at sex again, instead of a fear-based model, or, sex is only for reproduction purposes, or, here are the STIs and this is what can happen to you. Looking at sex through a pleasure model of this is your body, this is your sexual autonomy. And how do you want to explore your sexuality? And that is a healthy way to do it. I think, normalizing that your body is going to feel good. Our bodies function, it's just what our bodies do. And sexual arousal and, feeling different urges are a completely normal process.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. Because there's kind of I'm sure it's not new, especially in your field, but I've noticed more and more people saying it's so important to really feel your body and be in your body. And
Yes.
it's interesting how disconnected we are from our body that we have to like learn how to do that.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good point. And that's what I do spend a great deal of time teaching people to do is to get out of their heads and into their bodies. It's amazing. Going back to just the technology conversation we were having, technology is so useful, but I mean, in the digital age, it's also keeping people very preoccupied, and our brains are going, a million miles per hour. And if that's happening, we then try to go into the bedroom and expect wonderful things to happen. But if we're so in our heads, our body's not going to be responding. So there is a massive disconnect.
For just anyone that's listening that is having trouble feeling their body, what are one or two tips that you would give them to start that journey? Or just simple things they can do to just kind of be present and
Yeah, look, concentrating on your breath is a good way to jump back into your body. To actually, yeah, to see what your breath is doing, and that our breath will get faster, or pause and when we're stressed, and so that stress response just in general is not helpful. So bringing our breath down, there's box breathing techniques. There's many breath works that can be done in order to kind of regulate that body. From a sexual perspective, again, holding our breath, if that panic is starting, then our body is not going to be responding in a way that ideally we'd like it to. So breath is a fascinating way to kind of become a little bit more grounded and present.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. It's interesting because I sometimes will do like one of the hot yoga classes and it gets to be 120, 130 degrees in there, I'm telling you. But our teacher will always say, because people want to like puff and puff. And the teacher always says, if you do that, you're telling your body something's wrong. Just breathe normally and you'll tell your body everything's fine and you'll feel fine. And it's so true. It's so true.
Yes.
The moment you're really present with the breath and just like breathing normally, you're in this hot room, but you're okay. But when you're like panting and overventilating, you know what I mean? It's
Then you're not okay.
yes.
The
Yeah,
body's very clever.
it is. What are your thoughts on camming?
Yeah, look, I think camming is a fantastic opportunity for not only the user, but also for the cam model. I think it's looking at it through the cam models, perspective. It is very empowering for a lot of. I know it's mostly female oriented or female dominated industry, so I will use the term female. Um, but it is empowering, not only from a financial perspective for having, the time and the ability to do that whenever you like, but also to, I think, to regain your sexuality, right? To feel sexually empowered, and to be doing things that you want to be doing. And I think that is often overlooked for anybody who is a sex worker, a cam model, or in that industry. It can be very empowering.
It's interesting because I've interviewed many models, and one thing that many of them tell me is that they learned about themselves sexually through this career. Like they didn't even know because they kind of would explore something with a member and they'd be like, wow, I'm actually really into that myself. And so they were able to explore themselves in a sense and figure out what they never want to do again, what they absolutely love. And it's like they became these women that took control of their pleasure and helped other people find their pleasure. And there's just even an energy to some of them when you're talking to them that they're very much in their power, you know?
And that is just so amazing. That's exactly, one of the beauties that that we can experience. And I think just from a personal perspective, I really dislike how any sex work or camming or whatever approach you want to look at it, how there's this massive stigma because it is just work, but it's not looked at it through the lens of you know consent or body autonomy or through the positives.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting. You named like quite a few positives that the models are receiving, such as taking control of their finances, their own pleasure, and learning about themselves. And sometimes I wonder if that's part of the problem that society has with sex workers. Camming's interesting because no one ever touches anyone. I'm curious what your thoughts would be on, from the member side, what they're receiving beyond just the sexual content, because that's what's obvious. You know what I mean? Like
there is an element to that sexual release. Yes, I'm sure for most cases, there would be an element of that. But then we're also looking at potentially, feeling desired. I think that is something fundamentally most people would like to feel is, people want to feel desired. They want to be wanted. So to have that dialogue, to have that, even in a private room with a CAN model, right? To have that feedback and to feel wanted is only going to help people feel good.
Yeah.
Right. Sometimes sex or masturbation is helpful for validation, right? They need that for themselves. And, sometimes that's a massive thing. That's what people really need from that sexual experience.
Absolutely. And kind of going back to that point of if you're dealing with self-esteem issues and then you're being put in this professional environment where it's almost a guarantee for a member that they're going to have a positive experience. That is what they're paying for, And so
Right.
you keep getting these positive experiences. I can see how that would start to boost someone's confidence. And I have had members tell me, they were using Jasmin for 6 months and their boss pulled them into their office and was like, "You've been doing great at work. Like, what's gotten into you?" It's just that confidence.
Well, exactly. It's a positive feedback loop.
Yes, absolutely.
Feel good about, especially having that sexual release. It's going to release happy hormones as well. We're going to feel better about ourselves and our life.
Yeah.
I think also that, going back to fantasies, that it does help people explore themselves better, especially in a safe, controlled environment. It's easier to divulge a fantasy or to kind of go down a specific path with somebody who there's not that connection to, where you're not going to, have to, in 10 years' time, talk about, oh, why did you bring this up? Why did you want to do that? That's so strange. Right. So it is very positive for people to go explore that. As a couples therapist, they'll all say that the contrary would be to learn better communication techniques so you can explore that with a partner and how two people can open up and kind of I guess, make their sex life even better through better communication.
Fascinating. Yeah.
So pros and cons, really.
Yes. Have you ever seen a piece of research or maybe heard some type of story or something that just really stuck with you that you found really, really fascinating and interesting?
One piece that does stick with me is spontaneous desire versus responsive desire. And Emily Nagoski in her book Come As You Are discusses a lot of this. I'm not sure if you've kind of read about this, but I really find this helpful and fascinating, where it actually helps differentiate people in relationships as well, because and it kind of normalizes that it's okay to be different. So responsive desire would look like, you might be kissed on the neck, and then all of a sudden you might think about sex. Or you might go on a great date and have great conversation and then feel connected and then want to have sex. And predominantly women fall into that category. Spontaneous desire is, looking at life, maybe you see a billboard or an ad, you think about a past sexual experience and you might get spontaneously aroused. And so, most men fall into that category. So men want sex to be spontaneous, right? There's that element of spontaneity that makes it more erotic, more hot. And, women might fall in the responsive desire category where they're going to need more warming up. They're going to need more connection sometimes. And so it's finding a balance between the two and educating people on, hey, you're just different. How do these two work together?
Fascinating. That is really interesting. Yeah.
So that's really stuck with me. And it really plays out in a lot of couples experiences that I get to be a part of and talk about with people.
I can imagine. Yeah. I feel like this is like a very like clear fight that probably happens a lot. The man is like, she's not sexual at all anymore. And she's like, well, he's not romantic at all anymore. He doesn't listen to me. He doesn't whatever, because that's what she needs to feel romantic, and maybe he'd feel more inclined to give her those things if he felt like she was being more spontaneous. It's vicious.
Exactly.
I'm curious, how did you get into this profession? What drew you in?
I guess you could say I've lived a really interesting, colorful life. And I've got to experience things on a personal level, that probably would be judged by society on many different levels. And I guess from an empowering perspective, I like working with people so that they can learn that it's okay to like whatever you like. And I just find it fascinating to be able to help people on that level. Sex is just a fascinating topic, and when you dissect it all day, it's just something that you just continually dive into, and you just every day I just learn something new. It's fantastic.
Absolutely. I mean, I can only imagine that studying sexuality, helping people with their sexuality, and sex research is one of the most interesting things. I feel like it probably never gets boring.
Exactly.
Is there anything else about the world of connection, relationships, or sexuality that we didn't touch on, but that you feel is important to say or to share?
Yeah. Look, I think intimacy can mean different things to different people. And it's about trying to understand what is intimate and what is connecting for an individual, and being feeling confident but also feeling safe to explore that with someone. I think it's really hard to I mean, we could define intimacy, but if not everybody looks at it the same way, it's really interesting to understand where people get their ideas from, what shaped their lens on sex and intimacy. And it's not always a clear cut approach to the world. And I think we haven't really touched on it, but there's so many social constructs that affect people and affect how they see sex and intimacy. Social media, religion, friends, movies, pop culture. It kind of changes people's attitudes and expectations around what sex and intimacy should look like. So I think that's really important to kind of think about, because when we're trying to, again, go back to being a certain way, or the concept that only hot people or of a specific age have sex, it really isolates everyone who doesn't fall into that demographic, which is, we're all just people. You don't have to be a certain size, a certain age, a certain color, a certain body type, a certain sexual orientation to be able to enjoy sex.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much.
That's okay. Thank you for having me.